Hello, good morning and welcome to this roundtable on pension reform for the 21st century. I'm Nicholas Timmins. It's my pleasure to chair this and to discuss it. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers. Starting on my right, we have Nigel Waterson, who is chair of the Board of Trustees of the pension provider Now. We have Debbie Abrahams, who's the Labour MP for Oldham East and Saddleworth and a member of the Work and Pensions Select Committee. We have Caroline Rookes, who's Director of Private Pensions at the Department for Work and Pensions. We have Mario Lopez, who's the Senior Policy Advisor on Pensions at the Confederation of British Industry. And we have Adam Marshall from the British Chambers of Commerce, where he's Director of Policy and External Affairs. It's now a remarkable 7 years since Adair Turner first produced the Pensions Commission report, which said there should be a new national pension savings scheme, which is now something called NEST, which will be the private saving thing we're partly going to be discussing today. And by the time this is fully up and running, with everybody contributing 8%, on the current timetable it will have been 12 years since the Commission reported, which if you think about it is more than a quarter of an average working life, even when state pension age has risen to 68 or 69. So no one can say this has exactly happened in a hurry and that no one is prepared. So our opening question is that given that all the changes that have taken place since this was originally set up, has enough been done by the government to address the concerns of the business community on pension reform? Adam, would you like to start?
From the perspective of many small and medium-sized businesses, the answer to the question has to be no. The reforms remain quite complex and the administrative costs that many of those businesses face are high. When you look at the government's own impact assessment, what it thinks is going to happen, over 80% of small firms are going to have to get external help just to get their scheme up and running. And that is a serious cost. But what I think is the bigger concern, particularly for the smallest, is really levels of knowledge and the amount of information they have at their disposal. What we find when we go out and speak to local businesses up and down the country is that level of knowledge remains quite low. And despite our efforts and efforts of other business organisations and providers, there will still be a bit of a shock, I think, to overcome in the months and years ahead, because those businesses will be basically coming late to the party. So a lot of work still to be done.
All right.
Well, I will agree with Adam that it's true that like a lot of the smaller employers will struggle a little bit at the beginning to sort of get a grip in the reform, because they're obviously very complex, they're very large, it affects all employees, it affects all employers. I think the government has done a good job from where we started to where we are today. There have been substantial improvements to the regime, and we see things like the 3-month waiting period, a simpler certification process. So there have been good steps in the right direction. And ultimately, this is such a complex area that will take time for employers to experience what has to be done, and they will learn when we go forward. So we are hopeful that it will be a bumpy ride at the beginning, but ultimately with any reform, this is always the case. But we think that the regime that has been put in place is robust enough that it can go forward over the long term and deliver what the government expected for it.
Yeah. How does it look from your point of view, Nigel?
But I think there's a lot of confusion amongst smaller employers. I think changing the timescale for auto-enrolment, I think it sends generally an unfortunate message about pension saving. But also many of the people working for these employers, these smaller employers, are firmly part of Turner's target audience. And Turner, as you referred to, Nick, I mean, he thought this would all be up and running by 2010. So there's a big chunk out of people's working lives that they'll never be able to make up.
I'll get back to your opening remarks, Nick, and that was really, this is going back 10, 12 years, isn't it? So the planning around much of the system, the auto-enrolment process has been there for a while. We're not always the best around planning for these sort of additional costs, are we?
No. Caroline.
Okay, well, I'm just picking up the point about how long it's taking, and yes, in an ideal world we'd do it more quickly, but I think we shouldn't underestimate the challenge of what we're doing. We're talking about introducing automatic enrolment to 1.3 million employers in the country. It's a huge reform. We are trying to change the culture so that we move to a cultural norm where saving in a pension is the norm both for employers and employees, and it's big. So I don't apologise for the fact that it's taking a long time to do it, and we're trying to do it right. Now, I hear what's being said about the level of knowledge, but obviously there is a longer time, particularly for smaller employers who are probably the ones who are least aware. We've got a major communications campaign which is being run by DWP itself, which hasn't yet started for employers. It started for employees in January, and we're working very closely with the pensions regulator, who have the lead on informing employers, and we're working with all our stakeholders and the industry so that we're getting consistent messages across to people. And finally, we will be monitoring progress. We've got time before all employers come in. We can monitor, and if we need to ramp up or make changes, we'll be able to do that.
Right. I mean, it does strike me that both your concerns are expressed about smaller and medium-sized employers, and they are not coming in for 2 or 3 years down the track. Surely they'd be much more concerned if the big employers were saying, we don't know what the hell we're doing at this point, because they start in October. I mean, do you think there's still time to get the message through, in the sense as Caroline is arguing?
Well, as I was saying, I think, you know, a lot of organisations, the chambers of commerce around the country included, are doing a huge amount to try to raise awareness and to link up those small and medium-sized companies with potential providers, of which luckily there's now a variety. But I think there is still going to be an issue, and it is going to be that sort of eureka moment when an employer realises what it is that they have to do, an employee sees that first chunk of their own contribution coming out of their pay packet, and a discussion is had between the employer and the employee. You know, when Mario said before that there might be some rocky starts, I think that's absolutely correct. And we need to do the best we can to prepare for that. Equally, I think that we need to pay attention to the resourcing available to the pensions regulator. Not many regulators of businesses in this country have 1.3 million people to have in their purview to regulate, and ensuring that they've got enough resource to help those small and medium-sized companies through what will be a difficult process is going to be very important.
We think a lot of the material they produce is very good, but it is a capacity issue. The regulator needs to be ready to understand that a lot of people are going to be knocking on the door saying, what do I need to do with this? And a lot of them will have absolutely no idea what this is all about. And, you know, the larger employers, you know, a lot of them, they have big HR departments, they have dealt with other issues. Smaller employers, usually you have a company secretary or a legal advisor, and that's it. And they have to deal with a lot of issues at the same time. So they will be asking questions. So, you know, the regulator needs to understand that at the beginning is going to be, you know, the large employers, they know what they're doing. In 3-4 months, the people who are going to be knocking on the door are people who have absolutely no idea about this, and they need to be ready for that. So certainly the regulator part is important. But ultimately, I think from a large employers, a lot of them already offer workplace pension schemes. So they know what it is. They know how to deal with some of the larger reforms. So, you know, the modus operandi is in there for them. It's just a matter of making sure that we know everyone. From CBI surveys, we know that large employers are a lot more aware of the changes coming, and they're starting to prepare. We're more concerned with those coming right behind it, which think, well, I still got a bit more time. Actually, that time is only 2-3 months window. After that, you're coming in very quickly into it. So, you know, we need to be ready for addressing that particular sort of middle tier chunk, which are coming after the large employer, because those will be the sort of the test for the reforms.
Right. Of course, it's one thing getting the employers up and running. The question is then, do people stay in? They'll be automatically enrolled. They will have the right to opt out. I mean, surveys suggest it might be anything up to 1/3 will actually opt out. And you know, the sort of unspoken assumption behind this idea with the evidence from states suggested 70, 75 plus, maybe even 80% would tend to stay in. How big a worry is it about opt-out, and how much is it in the employer's interest to make sure people don't opt out?
We expect that there will be some people opt out because it just isn't in their interest to save at the particular time. We are doing as much as we can to minimise opt-out, and this includes, as I say, a major communications campaign, getting across some clear messages to people that they may well have over 20 years in retirement, which I don't think people realise they have at the moment, that the sooner they start saving the better, that it's never too late, and that they will miss out. The employer, for the first time, will be contributing to the pension. So if an individual puts in the 4% minimum, they get another 4% on top, which is a big amount of money to miss out on. Now, is it in employers' interests? Well, I would say yes. It's in all our interests that we deal with the long-term challenge of ageing. If individuals don't save, then somebody is going to have to bear the costs in future of providing people with a standard of living. So I would say it's in all our interests for people to save in a pension. I would say generally it's a good deal for them to save, and we need to work together, as indeed we are doing, to get consistent and simple messages to people about saving.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that there's the immediate interest of the employer, though, that we also have to take into account here. I think we all share, as Caroline was saying, the long-term interest of people saving for retirement. My concern will be that employers' immediate interest will be not falling foul of the regulations and making sure that they comply with and discharge their duties. Whether the individual employee opts in or opts out is neither here nor there. It's whether they've done what they have to do under the regulations. Many of them tell us they're scared about being seen to give advice, because if they're seen to be giving advice, then they will fall foul of those regulations. So I think there's a very big challenge there. If we want to accomplish the long-term policy goal, it's actually about convincing individuals first and foremost about the need to make that investment.
My real concern is that unless the government acts sooner rather than later, I know it's had a green paper and is looking at this at this moment, unless it acts quickly over the basic state pension, the means tested benefits regime, journalists will be writing articles in the run-up to the different staging posts for auto-enrolment saying, is it worth your while to auto-enroll? And some unscrupulous employers, despite the legislation, will be waving these articles at them and saying, well, you don't really want to do this, do you? Here's some extra money for Christmas or whatever. And I think that's a real concern. If we don't get that right, then I think that will in itself increase the level of opting out.
I think there's a lot we can also learn from other schemes that have been introduced, such as in New Zealand, the Kiwi Saver, and the incentives that have been introduced there, and what we can gain from there. But again, it is about the communication strategy, and as I say, the different elements of that focused at the employers as well as at the individuals, the benefits that this will be to the business, but also to the individual and to society as a whole by having this very, very important scheme. So I don't think we should underestimate that.
I mean, a lot of the employers we discuss with CBI members is they saying, look, I have to do this, so I might as well make the most of it. You know, if I'm going to have to spend some money on a pension, I want to offer my employees a good pension, because ultimately it helps with the recruitment and retention. You know, this is not, give or take, I can save some money here and there. Employers look at benefit packages as sort of on a holistic view. It's salary, it's pension, it's on the other side benefits. So auto-enrollments offer an opportunity to take a step back and say, I have an overall package. How can I design that in a way that I'm going to keep my best employees, and how can I recruit the best employees that are out there? So it's an overall position. So I think leveling down is just saying, can I save a few quid here? Well, is it really that the issue, or do you want to keep the best employees that you have? And I think, ultimately a lot of employers understand that. So I wouldn't be so concerned, but obviously if the certification process is complicated, then how much time do you want your HR people to be spent walking through these?
Yeah, but we know what the certification process is now, don't we?
You do.
So, is it acceptable?
It is a lot better than it was. Originally it was. It's been significantly improved. Could it be better? It probably could be slightly better. It probably could be a bit simpler. But ultimately it's also about employers learning how to use it, and whether the regulator is providing that access, and also providing that sort of a slight flexibility of saying, we're not going to hit you straight on the head just because you've done something wrong on the first minute, but really sort of engaging with the employers and walking them through the process.
Yes. Yeah. I suppose the other point about auto-enrolment is, we talk about might be a third opt-out, but of course auto-enrolment comes around every 3 years.
Yes, it does.
I mean, this is not a one-off event, this is a process, so the fact that you may have a third initially does not mean to say that you won't over time end up with more people pension saving. I suppose the other interesting question is what broader impact will particularly the arrival of Nest, with its low cost, low charges, have on the broader market? There was, for example, there was a lot of suggestions that because it has a relatively low charge, that it will actually help bring down charges across the piece, and there's been an awful lot of criticism recently about charges for pensions.
Mm.
I'd be interested to see, do you think it will have that effect?
We know that the industry are in discussions about code of practice, particularly about charges. So this is a very positive thing for the industry as a whole that has been a byproduct, if you want, in terms of the auto regulation process. So transparency is one thing, but also in terms of the different products that could be being introduced by existing pension providers. The Now product, which I think was originally over in Scandinavia, wasn't it? And has entered the market. So particularly looking at pensions for low-income groups. So that's a positive thing. So charges and transparency, so you can compare products, very, very important to employers and employees. But as I say, the range of products that it provides as well.
Yeah.
I think Nest and a lot of the other new entrants into the market are particularly going to be important for micros, for businesses with a high level of staff turnover, for agencies, and for those who don't necessarily fit what I would consider to be the attractive sort of business, in inverted commas, for some of the more traditional providers. So I think it's going to be very important. And what I also think we've seen is a little bit of really good innovation and more consultation with the business community in the design and setup of the new system. I have to say Nest has been very good at coming to the business community to talk about how to make it work well, talk about the type of products, and also to talk about the channels for interaction, you know, things like mobile phone apps and various other things. And all of that is welcome in an industry which has been seen as a very traditional one over time. So it's great to see both Nest and other new entrants innovating in the market.
Right.
I think the combination of Nest and Now Pension is certainly helping shine a penetrating light on charging levels and transparency or lack of transparency. We did a study at Now showing that you could lose up to about 36% of your pension pot in charges very easily, comparing us with just any comparable UK scheme. And isn't it interesting that some of these traditional providers that Adam mentioned who've studiously ignored several million potential customers for years are suddenly popping up with their own versions of master trusts as a largely, I suspect, defensive measure. So I think we're certainly shaking up the existing industry, I hope for the better.
Yeah. But I'm interested in that defensive move by the, what you might call the established players, because if they actually were to take a significant chunk of the market, that will in turn have an impact on the finances of Nest, which is as one understands, it's set up to cope with a very wide range of customers. If it falls too low, Nest's own economies of scale won't work. So there's a kind of interesting public interest here, given there's taxpayers' money helping set it up, that you want Nest to be of sufficient scale to be able to operate effectively, whilst at the same time stimulating competition in the market. And there's a bit of a tension between those two.
But all the work that we've done suggests at the moment that Nest is on course to deliver sufficient scale for it to continue to be viable in the market. And we do want it to be viable. It has the public service obligation, as you say. It's got to be there to pick up those people, those employers that other providers don't want. But we want it to continue to have the positive impact on the market that it is having.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that the arrival of Nest has had an impact on charges, as Adam says, on engagement, how to communicate with individuals, but also raised a debate about investment strategies. It's, I think, been a positive influence all the way around, and that we definitely want to continue.
There's millions of potential customers, even if you take the gloomiest view on opt-outs. And I think it's true, Caroline's right, Nest is helping with others to drive down costs and increase value for money. And if Nest fails, I think it's bad news for all of us, actually.
Okay.
So it's in all our interests that Nest survive. But as she says, quite rightly, they have a universal service obligation, a bit like the Royal Mail. Hence, they get lots of taxpayers' money. I mean, people like us don't, but we don't have that universal obligation to take anybody, no matter how, if they keep their records in a shoebox or something. So that's the difference. But Nest really must succeed as part of the overall picture, I think.
Obviously, in terms of the level playing field is being slightly skewed against Nest with the restrictions. So it is important that we stick to the review date for those restrictions.
2017?
Yes. If not to consider it before. So it is important that we monitor to that and the impact on Nest.
Right. Well, my suspicion is partly why some of the established providers have set up platforms, is that they are worried that the cap, the £3,600 cap, and the transfers in and transfers out might go earlier in which case it would be a very different market.
Well, I think in fairness they did it because they expect in 2017, that's, as Debbie says, that's been confirmed despite the elongated timescale for auto-enrolment as the date for the review, that inevitably the constraints will be lifted at that point, which I think makes sense. I think to do it any earlier would move the goalposts yet again, particularly for new providers like us in the market who've already had to change our business model because of the change in the timetable. And I mean, I'm elderly enough to have been involved in the 2004 bill, and it was very clear that the point about the constraints was not to be protectionist. It was simply to let Nest target the Turner target audience in its early years. And when everything's up and running, yes, I think that's the fear of some of the traditional providers, that come 2017, Nest will be firing on all cylinders and will be going after their existing customers. That's the commercial thing that's driving these pop-ups, as they're sometimes called.
If you look at it from the employer and the employee perspective, the sunlit uplands that we all want to get to really is a market with some really strong competition in it, because we will see charges being driven down, we will see better outcomes both for the companies that are putting in investments in their people's future and in those individuals' future as well. I think Nigel's absolutely right that there is a big marketplace out there. My biggest concern right now actually is getting over the auto-enrolment phase in the first instance, rather than in some of the concerns around competition, because I think there is a huge clientele for various companies with various business models to go after.
Yeah.
But I think Debbie's right. We do need to keep those limits under review if they are adversely impact employers and employees.
Absolutely.
That's the important thing, and that's what we need to keep under review.
Yeah. I mean, it will make, by definition, it makes things difficult for some employees because they're going to hit the cap, and they'll have to go somewhere else to if they want to do more pension savings.
Well, the cap is actually, it's not as low, if you will forgive me, as you suggest. It's been uprated.
Yeah.
3,600 was when it was first introduced. I can't tell you precisely what it is. It's 4,000 something now.
4,200, I think, yeah.
Well done. And actually, if you look at the percentage of earnings that you need to hit the cap, it's quite high.
Yeah.
What it doesn't allow for, though, is for people to import a large lump sum if they get a lump sum, or if indeed they want to shift their pension. So on an ongoing basis, it's probably a reasonable level, and you're looking at people way beyond median earnings being hit by it. But we do need to look at it. It is impacting some employers that we might have thought would want to be involved in Nest, and we've got to see what the impact is.
If you're a big employer and you want to be more generous than the 3%, you can come to someone like Now Pensions Now and enrol the whole lot. So there isn't that issue. But I'm quite confident the constraints will go sooner or later, and probably in 2017. That's certainly the basis we've been working on.
This is the biggest policy change to affect many small and medium-sized companies and their employees, probably in a generation. So the fact of constant vigilance and the need to make tweaks to the market as and when they arise, I think it's really, really important. So yes, we can work to the date of 2017 for the review, but keeping that flexibility in the system as we start this process is going to be important.
Right. And one of the many other bits of current pension policy, we're talking about transfers in and transfers out, is small pots. Small pots becoming big pots, as Steve Webb, the Pensions Minister, would like them to be. That's clearly a pretty sensible goal. But if you want to aggregate small pots into something larger, one very obvious home for them is Nest.
But it's not the only home for them, and it's not the only solution. I mean, it is an important thing. It's probably worth taking a step back. The small pots and transfers work was probably arose because of the decision to get rid of short service refunds. Now, for the uninitiated, short service refunds are a refund of contributions that people can get if they leave a scheme within 2 years. And there was a good reason for introducing that at the time, which was to prevent schemes having to manage lots of very expensive small pots. But it hits straight up against the objectives of automatic enrolment, where you want people who change jobs frequently to be saving in a pension. So the decision was taken that short service refunds was probably not part of the landscape going forward. But if you got rid of short service refund, what do you do with the small pots, which are only going to increase with automatic enrolment? So at the moment, we are consulting until later this month on what we should do about small pots and transfers. And there are two radical sort of options in there. One is an aggregator, as you suggest, which Nest could be, but other providers might be. The other is that the pension pot follows the member when they leave their jobs, follows them around and accumulates, hopefully, to one of Steve Webb's big fat pots. There's also the possibility that perhaps a combination of the two might be the solution. We are working on that at the moment. We very much look forward to hearing people's responses before we decide which way forward on this.
We've already had a brief discussion with Steve Webb about this, because in Denmark they introduced a kind of electronic system for keeping track of all the small pots and consolidating them. But I think it needed, and I think here it would need a bit of a nudge from government to get it going. But the concept of a pensions hotel where people's pensions are parked for a period is, I think, perfectly doable. And I think if that's the way the government was going, we'd be up for doing it just as much as Nest or anybody else.
I think there are a lot of employers out there who would say that they're extraordinarily worried about the administrative burden in particular of aggregating small pots falling on them.
Yeah, we think it could be done without a cost to the employer or the taxpayer. But we're still working on that.
There's a big, the big concern is not to add additional requirements on employers when auto-enrolment is happening at the same time. I mean, our issue has been, when the short service refund consultation came out, CBI came against the abolition of the refund, and the reason was because the refund, it was said, well, is this refund being used for the employer to just keep the employer contribution, and the employee only takes their side of the contribution, and the employer is making some cash on the side. The reality was that it's all about administration costs, and ultimately a lot of the money that was left behind was used to reward those long-term employees that remained on the scheme, and it was in a sense an incentive for them to keep saving. If we close that door before we know we have an efficient sort of transfer system, what we're doing is simply creating a problem on one side and not providing a solution on the other. Now, we are at very early stage on the small pots sort of reform, but we are concerned with the practicalities of it. We see that, in an ideal world, it works, but, there are serious questions, even from a legal perspective, legal contracts that are put in place, issues about what if you are transferred to a scheme that has higher charges than the ones you are in, and you're done that automatically, and suddenly, you go, well, why did you transfer me automatically to this thing? I'm paying more money and my default fund is not as good. So there are a lot of questions that need to be answered. So in principle, yes, a good idea. But we need to work out the details, and certainly banning short service refund before those details are worked out properly will be a big mistake, because what we will end up having is employers having more costs. If we want Nest to be competitive, then we need to make sure that, in a sense, they are part of the wider sort of industry and the wider market. So the aggregator could work, but we need to make sure that we are not hindering one particular provider just because of that.
And the aggregator should have been thought of before the proposal to abolish short service refunds, but we're doing this the wrong way around here, to be honest with you. I mean, a lot of firms will have already invested on the basis that nothing was going to change until 2017, and then here we are, all change again. It's a classic thing that we do in the UK. We create a level of instability for employers that then undermines some of their confidence in the system. So the BCC was also very much against this change to short service refunds. Now, would we support a solution that helps bring small pots together in future? Absolutely, but we've got to do this right.
Yeah, it's important as well, because a lot of people are in the market shopping for schemes. If you go and set up a trust-based DC scheme today, or you did it 2 months ago, and suddenly you say, actually, we're going to revisit this entire short service refund debate, well, you're moving the market a little bit, and you're saying, well, I set up this scheme. It might not necessarily be this the only issue, but it certainly was a consideration. Then now, my scheme doesn't have the same features as it had before. And that creates certain instability for employers who are trying to shop around at the moment. So what we need is certainty for these employers to know what they're gaining today, and it's not being moved over in, say, 5 years' time in that space.
Yes, it would have been good if we'd got all of this sorted out before. But, I would say Steve Webb has been absolutely clear that short service refunds are not part of the future. So I think there is a clear message out there. But we are working on the solution, and we're working, with all of your organisations, and hopefully we will come up with an answer that suits the market, suits employees, and is in everyone's interest.
Yeah, fine. This is a slightly more open-ended question in a sense, but are there other bits of DC regulation that are worrying providers and employers at the moment? whether there's other things coming down the road that add to your instability or make it feel difficult to operate.
We've got over 46,000 DC
Yeah.
schemes in this country, many of them tiny with just a handful of people in them, and that's a very inefficient and expensive way of running pension schemes. So it's not just a matter of finding a pensions hotel for pension pots, that we also need to find a way of consolidation.
Yeah, we'll need that for DB as well. I mean, this discussion is mainly about DC.
And potentially for DB, for what remains of the DB share of pensions. But again, with transfers in from day one for people like Now Pensions, we can begin that process. And I know that regulators recently moved much more into looking at DC governance, and I think this is going to be an increasing preoccupation as DC really dominates the market already compared to DB, and as we get a lot of these so-called master trusts popping up in the auto-enrolment space with greater or lesser transparency of governance.
I think the regulator DC strategy is something that has come up, and we've been slightly concerned about one thing, and is the reputation of pensions policy in this country, and the fact that a lot of employers were badly burnt by the defined benefit over regulation, and the fact that it got to a point where DB became so expensive that you go into a promise 40 years ago. If you look at a promise today, it's very, very different. So from an employer perspective, if you're sitting there and saying, right, I need to set up a pension scheme for auto-enrollment and I want to go DC, the noises about DC regulation, there is a natural distrust in employers around pension regulation. And the moment the regulator is talking about DC regulation, the employer is thinking, am I going to get into something that it says is DC today, but it's going to look very different in a few years' time, and I'm going to lose my competitive advantage. And those dice on the back of the mind of every employer. So I will be very, I'm concerned that the noises has to be right, and we need to make sure that the message coming through is not one of saying DC is going to be over-regulated the same way DB was, because a lot of employers will go and say, well, I don't want that. I don't trust government to deliver on that, because we've seen some messages from the past. I'm just going to go to Nest and get rid of it. And then what you're missing there is that wish to innovate from the employer side, because they're just concerned that they're going to set up something and it's just going to look completely different in a few years' time because of regulation.
What you hear from the business community is a very legitimate complaint. They say we are long-term in our thinking, but it's politicians and the government who are the ultimate short-termists. They express their short-term goals via constant changes to regulation. So what the businesses come back to us and say on a day-to-day basis is, on this issue, again, one of the biggest policy changes in a generation, they want a regulatory framework that is stable for the medium to long term, but with flexibility at the margins to deal with any unintended consequences or market problems that may occur. They understand that some things may need to be changed as we put this architecture together, but they want to know that the bedrock sort of fundamental principles will remain the same. It makes it easier for them to invest, it makes it easier for them to be positive, and I don't think we should underestimate the importance of positivity in the business community when talking about regulation, because it doesn't take much talk down the pub at the end of a long week for these sorts of things to start to go awry.
As the politician here, do you feel over-legislate?
As a Labour politician, not in government, it's something I'll certainly be taking back to our shadow pension minister. I think they're very fair points. That we need stability in the industry around regulation if we're going to have confidence in the system.
One of the interesting bits about the over-regulation of DB, though, was an awful lot of it came along in response to scandals. It was a governmental response to things that went wrong. And when you look back with hindsight, you say, well, it built up this enormous burden on schemes, which is undoubtedly true. But kind of a lot of it was response to Maxwell. A lot of it was, and the worry for DC is that so long as DC behaves itself, it may survive with relatively limited regulation. If we start discovering rip-offs, there will be a political response.
I mean, we all want good member outcomes. We want low charges, we want good governance, we want good administration. And as far as we can do it without regulation, I think that's absolutely what we want. But, at the end of the day, as you're saying, the regulation has to be a sort of balance between protecting members on the one hand and not imposing too big a burden on employers and providers on the other. And we have to somehow strike that balance. Now, I think in the context of this, we are doing a lot of things without regulation. We're relying on codes of good governance, codes of practice, the work on transparency of charges, which NAPF is leading, the work on annuities and the open market option, which ABI has been leading. We've taken a power to cap charges in future for deferred charges if they become too high. So the position at the moment is that we're doing as much as we can without regulating. And as long as things go forward in the way that we want them to, we all want them to, then hopefully we won't need to impose more legislative strictures on providers and employers.
The guidance, industry guidance sort of code of practice that we had is the right way forward for DC particularly, because it's a complex area of work, because people talk about charges like charges are money you're taking from the person, but those charges also are being used to administer the scheme, to use it to pay for investment management, etc. So all of that has to be talked in a way that is sensible. The other thing I would say on the DB side is, it is true that there were some scandals like Maxwell and a few others where changes to regulation had to be done. Problem is that those were they were illegal at that point, and they're illegal at this point. What we had was a sort of, we went beyond the scandal. We went a lot further than they was, and it has become this web of sort of regulation that now you have things like, without going too much into sort of the technicalities, but things like Section 75 employer debt, something that was created for one purpose, today is stopping companies from being able to restructure and make the business more efficient. Now, was that the intention of the regulation? It wasn't. No. And we have that problem now. We have Europe coming out with Solvency II ideas, which for us is a problem because we have full indexation, for example, of benefits. So there are a lot of unintended consequences of defined benefit regulation. That's what employers are concerned. It's not that government doesn't have good aims in mind, but it's whether the unintended consequences that makes this very expensive for the employer at the end of the day.
We're really seeing the industry being forced into this position now, aren't we, because of the opening up of the market around auto-enrolment. And it's disappointing that it's taken until now, really, to enable consumers to be able to compare on a level playing field. And I certainly think from the Select Committee's point of view, we were disappointed, really, that the industry is being shoved in that direction. And I think the committee is minded to, be saying, hopefully this will mean the code of practice is sooner rather than later. It is very important that if we're going to get buy-in to the system, that we need to be able to have a transparent system that people can have confidence in.
And there wouldn't be a problem with high, I totally agree with Debbie, but there wouldn't be a problem with high charges if there was any correlation at all between high charges and high returns.
Exactly.
But there isn't. Nor is there a transparency about how charges are levied and on what basis, whereas for us, like Nest, it's £1.50 a month and it's 0.3% on your annual management charge. End of story. That's it. Whereas far too many of the existing providers still want to have this rather Byzantine charging system, and also choice. We're not offering any choice to people. There's one scheme which we think will be well run. Choice adds complexity. It makes people nervous. The evidence is if they make a choice, they almost certainly make the wrong one, and it adds cost. Above everything else, it adds more cost and more people taking a chunk of the pot.
If your offer is out there on the table and is understandable to all consumers, whether they're an employer or an employee, you're going to force some of the other providers who are less clear on their pricing structures to come clean.
Well, I hope so.
Just before we finish, if there's one thing that you would like to see happen to make auto-enrolment and pension reform a success, what would that be? And then I'll ask Caroline, who's in a sense got to take some of these ideas away and implement them, to sum up. Nigel.
Well, I go back to something I said earlier, Nick, which is I think government, and they've certainly got this firmly on board, really need to sort out means-tested benefits and the interface, because at the end of the day, if people are auto-enrolled, think they're doing the right thing and end up no better off, there's going to be a lot of unhappy people out there, and when the music stops, whoever's in government at that moment is going to get a lot of bad publicity, I think. And we're there to make people's lives better in retirement, and that means it's got to be worth most people's whiles, not everybody, but most people's whiles, to be auto-enrolled, to allow themselves to be auto-enrolled, and to start saving into a reasonable pension.
For me, it would be the monitoring process about uptake, and particularly to monitor who is actually being auto-enrolled. we mustn't forget why we're doing this. This is about ensuring that the most vulnerable employees have savings in their retirement so they can have a decent retirement income. So we must be monitoring those to make sure that it's being effective.
It's information, information, information. There are too many businesses out there who are grappling with this and trying mightily to keep their heads above water. More can still be done, and I'd say that that's a responsibility not just of government, but of all of us, both in the industry and in employer organisations, to make sure that information gets out there.
Bebici can take that one on, and I'll add my own one. I think for us, main thing will be just certainty around the entire regime. I think for us, we know that the economic situation, is difficult for a lot of people. A lot of people are going to opt out because they don't think they can, their incomes are under pressure, etc. We don't need to panic. We obviously take-up is going to be lower than we expected at the beginning, but one of the reasons is the economic situation. This is a long-term regime. This is about going through economic cycles. We need to make sure that we understand that it's going to be lower take-up at the moment, but in a few years' time when the economy picks up, those numbers are going to go up. If we start panicking and doing small changes to try to get take-up up, it's just not going to happen. And what you're going to get instead is employers being concerned that the goalpost is being moved. So the main thing is just make sure that we have a regime and we stick with that regime going forward with a lot of information so employers know what they're doing.
Yep, Caroline.
Okay,
steady as you go.
Yes.
Don't fiddle.
I mean, in some respects, I'm actually reassured by what I hear, because I certainly can't commit to changes to the basic state pension. I mean, you need Steve Webb to sit here to do that. But there is a lot of work going on that. And I would say as well that there's been quite a lot of scaremongering about the impact of means-tested benefits. It is a difficult situation because under the current system it would be very hard to identify particular groups for whom it would not pay to save. But for the vast 90-odd% people, it does. On information, yes, I think we very much share your objective. We will be putting out as much communications and information as we can and working with providers to get consistent messages so that we're all saying the same things in the same way and hopefully people are hearing us. I would say my team and I would like as much stability as possible. We will be monitoring what happens. Not only will we be looking at who's opting in, who's opting out, but thinking about what that means. Yes, thinking about whether we need to make changes, but mindful that it is a very, very long-term programme. We can't and we must avoid any knee-jerk responses until we're really, really clear what's happening, but we will be watching it as closely as we possibly can. And it's reassuring, I think, because it is a programme that has support from all sides, both politically and non-politically. I think all organisations are behind it. We're all trying to make it work, and I hope we will all succeed.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we come to an end. It's been a stimulating and interesting discussion, which I hope you have enjoyed as well. And I'd just like to thank our panel of speakers for giving up their time and hopefully giving you something to think about. Thank you very much.